Well, it's so great to see all these attendees coming in. Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to launching a career in aerospace, which is part of our leadership sequence in our signature series of Career Month. I'm Joshua Levitt. I'm a proud college alumnus and staff member at UChicago Alumni. It is my responsibility and pleasure to provide lifelong learning opportunities and professional development events that bring together our Maroon community. I'm delighted to introduce Dave Fisher, who is the head of the UChicago Space Network, which is leading this event today.
Hey, thank you, Josh. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Everyone, thank you for joining us today. As Josh said, I'm Dave Fisher. I'm also a proud college alumnus, AB 87 back in the day. Really happy to have the opportunity to have you all here today. I've known Chris for many years, and I guarantee that this is going to be a really fruitful conversation today. I'll tell you just a little bit about the Space Network. So we exist with the mission to provide a community for people who are interested in space, both alumni and current students, and everything that comes with a community. So networking, mentorship, career development, business development opportunities, everything, as I said, everything that goes along with having a community. Welcome to this community. I would encourage you all to join this community as well. I will drop into the chat both my own email as well as a link to our LinkedIn group, which is a great way to stay in touch. So with that, I'd like to introduce Gaurav Kumar, who is our Vice President for Communication, and he is going to introduce Chris and MC the conversation today. So again, thank you all for being here, and I hope that you enjoy today's conversation. Gaurav, over to you.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Josh, and the audience for taking time to attend our Space Talk. Happy New Year, and welcome to 2023. We are really privileged to have Chris Quilty attend, and speak during the first Space Talk for this year. And Chris has been in the industry for many years. He is the founder and partner at Quilty Analytics, which is an independent boutique financial advisory firm which focuses on strategic research, strategic advisory, and investment banking services for all aspects of satellite and space industry. Prior to establishing Quilty Analytics, Chris was the sell-side research analyst with Raymond James for 20 years, and he is one of the well-known, widely acknowledged leading Wall Street analysts for satellite and space industry. He has been covering space industry, when there were just few analysts who were covering the space industry. So he has a lot of knowledge and wisdom to share with us today. Chris has got his bachelor's in systems engineering from United States Naval Academy, and he has an MBA from University of Chicago. Chris's podcast was rated Constellation's most popular and one of the most downloaded podcast episodes for 2022. So we are really lucky to have Chris here today. Thank you, Chris, and welcome.
Thank you. You know why it's the most downloaded is because I tend to go off the rails and people enjoy watching that. So just to give you a heads up. Perfect.
I think this is the best crowd to get off the rails, Chris. So, we are all ready for that. And Chris, the intention, as Josh mentioned, we are doing this podcast or this Space Talk during the Career Month. So there will be a lot of focus on career opportunities, and if you can guide around, the career opportunities in the space industry, that will be great. But before that, can you please talk about your career journey in the space industry and also introduce Quilty Analytics to the audience?
Yeah, okay. So I'll try to do this quickly in a rambling manner, but you've covered a lot of the high points of my career history. But just to encapsulate, I was undergrad at the Naval Academy. I spent 5 years in the Navy, got out and needed to figure out what to do with my life. And seeming like going to business school seemed like a good way to delay having to figure out what I was going to do with my life. Since I don't think I had ever taken, maybe I took a basic econ class, but didn't have a lot of business skills, and the MBA seemed like the smart thing to do. I went from Chicago, which I graduated in 96, straight to work for Raymond James and spent 20 years there. But there's a side story. In the midst of eating enough hors d'oeuvres to kill an elephant at Chicago, I interviewed and talked with just about everybody. I was looking at management consulting. I was looking at, C-level training programs. I was looking at financial services. And how did I settle on Raymond James? Well, I don't like the cold. I mean, despite the fact I went to Chicago and I grew up in New York, but I'm sitting here in my office in Florida with a couple layers on, wool socks, and I got a heater under the table here, and it's, I think, 75 degrees outside. But, Florida, I'd spent some time there in the Navy, seemed like a fun place to go. Raymond James was financial services, but it wasn't in New York. And I'm like, what the heck? So I bid all my points on the interview. And it was actually for a sales position at Raymond James. But as it turns out, the sales director wasn't available. So the director of research showed up, did the interview, for some reason liked me. And he's like, hey, would you like a job in research? Because sales sucks. That was the first mistake. He lied to me because sales was, like, on a relative basis, a lot less work for a lot less money. But I digress. So I took the job in research at Raymond James because I had a military background. I kind of went into a lot of research on the pure defense sector. But again, I chose to cover small cap defense companies. And what happened to small cap defense companies after 9/11? Literally every single one of them got acquired. So I had nobody to write research on. So in order to stay gainfully employed, I reinvented myself, and I decided, okay, there's not a single person on Wall Street writing on the space industry, which should have been a clue that something was wrong, but I'm a little dense. So I was like, oh, well, the telecom guy doesn't want it, and the industrial guy doesn't want, I could do this. So lo and behold, I went out, ordered some books on Amazon on how rocket engines work and started teaching myself about the industry. And, the long story short, it worked out well. The industry, has hit this massive secular growth phase, which really kicked off in 2015, at least from a funding cycle perspective. And in 2016, I decided it was time to hang up my hat and do something different. However, my idea was to go out. I had a number of job offers to do corp dev, biz dev, IR, strategy, CFO in the industry. And instead, I took the bad advice of Bill Gattle from Harris Corp, who said, well, hey, Chris, you're the only analyst who writes on Wall Street, only analyst on Wall Street that writes on the space industry, and you're kind of good. Why don't you just do this and charge people? And I was like, oh, thanks, Bill. That's a stupid idea. But it was a stupid idea that somehow resonated with me. So I called up a bunch of my institutional investor clients and companies in the industry. And enough of them said, yeah, we'd actually pay for the stuff you write, that I decided to kind of step out on a limb in 2016, hang my own shingle, and start writing space industry financial research. It took me about a year, but I lured over my investment banker from Raymond James as my partner. And we've got, including some outside contractors we use, like a 10-man shop. So it's a pretty tight group of people. And part of the reason it's tight is because I can name on my two hands the number of people in the world who actually understand the space industry and understand finance, at least in a way that we do, where we write, very thoughtful, I think, and insightful, pieces on the industry. And it's everything from transactional stuff, the fact that Maxar just got acquired, by a private equity firm. And can you write something meaningfully beyond what the trade press publishes, or even doing in-depth research pieces on electronically steered flat panel antennas. And again, we don't do that from a technical perspective, but from a business perspective. So I also told you what Quilty Analytics does, which is we have one side of the company that publishes research on the industry, on a paid subscription basis. And my partner, Justin, runs the investment banking side of the business, which, again, because we have such a tight network of folks who we know in the industry, we stay pretty busy on the banking side. I think last year, the biggest transaction was selling a Lithuanian satellite manufacturer called Nano Avionics to Norway's state defense fund or firm Kongsberg, which was like a 70 million transaction, but we've had a number throughout the industry. So anyways, that's the quick nutshell. I am dialing in again from St. Petersburg, Florida, which is where Raymond James was located. I thought about potentially moving, but heck, I don't pay any state taxes. My kids have one set of clothes they wear year round, and it's 20 minutes to the airport. So just saying.
Thanks, Chris, for that great introduction. Before we jump to the next question, I was just following on the chat that we have the Chicago Booth Space Club dialing in from one of the lecture halls in Harper Center. So if we can take a moment to zoom on them and let Alex, who is a chairman of the club, say a few words about the Booth Club, that will be great.
Technology at work. There we go. Yeah.
We need to figure out which satellite is getting this data, Chris. Okay. We'll park that for now. When they come online, we will put the spotlight on them. Chris, the next question is about the industry itself, and you have seen the industry growing. You have seen the industry transforming from the place where nobody was talking about it to now when you cannot read a newspaper or any news feed without something about space. So can you talk a bit about how the industry has evolved and what are the main drivers and the main aspects of that which you can share?
Yeah. So as I said earlier, like I did not grow up a space geek knowing the names of all the astronauts on all the Apollo missions and stuff like that. And I still don't pay a ton of attention to that side of the business, the civil side. But what's important, I'll give everybody context here. Here's how to think about the space industry. We all know it started with the launch of Sputnik, right? And then it set off this geopolitical arms race to be the first on the moon. I think it was over 5% of the US budget was being spent on space. And then when we got boots on the moon, there was nothing left to do. And the space program went into remission for about a decade or more, actually. Until in the 1990s, there was a second big investment phase. Now, most people forget about this one, even though at the time it had the largest corporate bankruptcy in history, which was Iridium Communications, which had spent $5 billion building the constellation, and they went bankrupt within months. And what saved the industry from that embarrassment was the internet bubble crashing shortly afterwards, and everybody sort of shift their gaze. But the point is, by the early 2000s, there were only a couple of public companies that were involved in the space industry, sort of like pure play companies, as basically the defense primes that ran the world. And so a couple of things happened. And the most important one was SpaceX and Elon Musk. And I'm not just being gratuitous. The key point here is the space industry really had not changed. It was a government-dominated, government-run enterprise, even though you had this period in the 1990s where there was a bunch of corporate investment. Because I failed to mention, it wasn't like the space race. It wasn't the government funding. This sort of 1990s space hysteria was funded by Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Marconi, and they were big corporations trying to do these programs, and they all failed and bankrupted. What's different about this time, what I'll call Space 3.0, is that the fundamental choke point for the industry has been, let's not say resolved, but it's gotten a lot better, which is launch, right? So up until Elon Musk showed up on the scene, the cost of launch had not changed in over 50 years. about $10,000 to $20,000 to put a kilogram in space, which is why you see these lunar landers being, made out of aluminum foil, because, you're just shooting to reduce weight as much as possible. And what SpaceX did was lower launch cost by an order of magnitude. So you can buy a Falcon Heavy for $1,600 a kilogram instead of $10,000 to $20,000. That's pretty dramatic. And if they're successful with their Starship, which is a rocket that could launch any day now, actually, from down in Brownsville, Texas, that thing has a bigger lift capacity than the SLS, which famously launched for $4 billion a rocket a couple of months ago. Not a fan of that program. But here's the thing. Once you lower the cost of launch and increase access to space, suddenly business models that couldn't close, whether it's manufacturing fiber optic fiber in space and returning it to Earth, or pharmaceuticals, or building a commercial space station, or a data center on the moon. Suddenly you can actually pencil this out. And I do this with people that come at me with business models. And you can actually say, holy crap, you know what? It's cheaper to store data on the moon than it is on Earth, which is true, believe it or not, but we can get back to that later. So with SpaceX having opened up the spigot on business models, and importantly, that's the other big change that's happening here, is we're going from a government-dominated activity to one that is principally being driven by commercial profit-seeking businesses. It's not NASA funding some crazy study at basic science. These are companies that are raising equity, from investors with the promise of a return. And that's why I think this time things are sustainable. I don't see launch costs going back up. And, with the aperture open, you're just seeing tons, like literally hundreds of businesses being formed. And I'll give you a metric here. Prior to 2015, the space industry had attracted less than 10 venture funding rounds a year for the decade prior. And I think the average of capital raised every single year was about $140 million. In 2021, I haven't finished the numbers for 2022 yet. It was $11 billion that was raised last year. So that's the other big change, right? You've got launch costs down, and now you have access to capital, which, in large part has been venture capital money. And historically, VCs, investing in space is the antithesis of a venture model. It's capital intensive, it's long-term, it's government involvement. And yet you've got, these, independent billionaires like Richard Branson and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos that are throwing their own money. And you've got these venture firms plowing money into the industry. So we're sitting at a really interesting place. The industry kind of survived COVID with nothing more than a hiccup. There's a number of companies that are starting to scale up constellations, but we're also in a down market. And this industry has never been through a down cycle that is dependent upon venture funding. And so one would suspect there are going to be a number of failures that happen in the next 12 to 24 months as the funding spigot, closes or tightens up. And that's not a bad thing, because we all know, it requires creative destruction, and to the degree that bad ideas continue to get funded, it implicitly draws funding away from the better ideas. So basically buckle your seatbelt for 2023. It should be an interesting year for the industry.
Yeah. And Chris, you recently spoke about also the defense budget. And I understand that, that the VC money might be, there's a decline in that. But on the other hand, the $480 billion of defense budget, which has been approved, what can you talk a bit about how is that going to impact the industry? Sorry, 840, I said 480, it's $840 billion. How is that going to impact the industry, and what kind of opportunities will that create?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The government is both a blessing and a curse. And what I would say is there are really two service producing industries in the space industry. I'm going to put aside video, TV stuff. That's a large chunk of revenue, but it's really a consumer media business. If you look at the balance of the industry, there's two services that are delivered. There's data, right? Satellite communications. It's everything from, when you swipe your credit card at a gas station, it's very high likelihood it's done over a satellite connection, to ATM machines and backhaul for cellular towers. That's the biggest part of the industry. The next biggest silo, and I'll put a number on it, let's call that $24 billion a year of wholesale revenue. The next biggest industry at about $3 billion is the Earth observation industry, which today is primarily optical. But we've all seen, in news stories, some of the synthetic aperture radar images coming out of Ukraine. There's companies building hyperspectral and thermal and infrared sensors, greenhouse gas detecting sensors. So there's an entire another industry there that's primarily where most of the government activity has been focused. For the older industry, the SATCOM, government's probably 20% of industry revenues, but when you flip over to Earth observation, it's still 80% of the revenues are government based. So here's the challenge, right? Government budgets do grow, unfortunately, and pretty large numbers recently, but there's a fixed pie with government. Like, you can fight others for government budget, you can hope that the government funds new activities, but if you want to establish a growth business, like a real growth business, it better well have a commercial component to it. So where does the government help? Well, having a government contract and endorsement, from the government is important to investors, right? Even if the contribution is not meaningful. And the other thing with the important about the government is it's not generally non-dilutive equity. So they're going to give you a grant or a contract to demonstrate something you were going to do anyways, and they give you money to do it. And there is a whole hodgepodge of government agencies. I'll call out the Defense Innovation Unit, based out in Silicon Valley, was created by former Defense Secretary Ash Carter during the Obama administration, specifically to work with Silicon Valley to try to get these tech inventors to focus on government focused projects. So DIU funds, as does the AFWorks out of the Air Force and a whole slew of other agencies. They fund a lot of the development work for startup companies, and they tend to focus on the stuff that's really, really hard. Not many companies out there interested in trying to develop a nuclear propulsion system for satellites, because the barriers are so high, but DIU has funded a company to do just that. They also funded a company recently to demonstrate active debris removal from space. I talk to every one of my companies that operate satellites, and they all have dead satellites, and you ask them, how much would you pay to remove that satellite? And the answer is nothing, because there's no requirement to do it, and it's a cost. And other than maybe some PR benefit, there's nothing that forces companies to do it. So DIU is trying to create a market and an activity around debris removal. And you know what? Lo and behold, you've now got the FCC has stepped in and imposed a rule around requirements for active debris removal. So I would argue, and Dave knows this because Dave works for Astroscale that's involved in debris removal. I wrote a report 3 years ago that said, hey, this is just not commercially viable. And I would change that view today, because if these government rules come in place, mandating activity that perhaps we should all be doing anyways, picking up after ourselves, that's a great example of where the government can basically breathe life into new industries.
Thanks, Chris. And, while we are on the industry topic, I'll take a question from the audience. There's a question: now that SpaceX and others have built the infrastructure to reliably and cost effectively reach space, what are some of the interesting applications you are seeing being worked on? Relatively, do you see any promising applications in zero gravity manufacturing?
Yes. All the above. So, I mean, we maintain a database of startup companies in the industry. I think I've got over 300 companies. A lot of them are vaporware, but whatever. But 300 that have announced some sort of cislunar business activity. Now, let me define the term cislunar, just so everybody's on the same page. Generally, most satellites like SpaceX, right? Their LEO broadband Starlink system is flying about 800 kilometers up in LEO. Historically, most of the satellite communications was done from the geostationary belt out at like 36,000 kilometers. What cislunar refers to is from the geo belt all the way out to the moon and its Lagrange points. And that's a very large area. What did it take the Apollo guys? Like a couple of days to fly to the moon, 2 to 3 days, right? So there's a lot of space out there, and there's a lot of stuff going on out there. And there is a monster horse race going on for the moon. It was one of the issues I didn't answer for you when you asked about the government and the government's role. The U.S. government, and let's call it the Space Force, right? They're still in the middle of this. Like the Air Force still does it. Like the Navy, which has its own space programs, they like literally changed the name on the building to take out the word space in hopes that the Space Force wouldn't take that unit away from them. So let's use Space Force for now, because that's just the easy go-to. They have huge concerns around what is happening in cislunar space, what they don't know is happening there. And there are companies looking all the way from low Earth orbit out to cislunar and the moon at different business models. I have met with a number of companies that want to build, let's say, for manufacturing in space, which sounds kind of esoteric, but they've done it on the space station. In fact, there was a dude that told me there's a $2 billion royalty business that exists based on chemistry demonstrations they did on the ISS, and it's used in your Tide and all your detergents to keep solids separated in solution and whatnot. So there's lots of stuff that happens. But, the companies that I've met with that have business plans to make, for example, Z-bland fiber, which is a really, really esoteric, clean fiber, when you have to do things like, medical devices and the laser has to be really precise. You can manufacture that stuff in space at total purity because there's no gravity. And there's a couple companies that have said, hey, we're going to launch up capsules, manufacture this stuff and bring it down to the Earth. I have not they don't have to, they're private companies. They haven't shared their Excel spreadsheet model with me, which I wish they would. But, these are smart people, and they didn't start this business, with a business model that didn't close. So they think based on existing launch costs, based on existing satellite bus costs, they can make this model close. That's exciting. I mentioned the lunar data storage, right? It's actually a guy here in town who I know, Chris Stott, Lone Star Lunar, and he's raising a seed round now. He's got big government contracts behind him. And I did, because Chris is a friend, I sat down with his CFO and spent a half day penciling through the numbers. And I can say explicitly, yeah, you know what? It's crazy, but it is cheaper to build a data center on the moon because you don't have land acquisition costs. You don't have cooling costs. You drop it down in a lava tube. It's in a perfect, stable Faraday cage. The transport costs to get stuff there is about the only expense. But after that, it runs on its own. So I'm excited. I think if the industry today is two industries, it's satellite communications and Earth observation. And there's launch companies and satellite manufacturers and ground companies, the hardware guys that are all behind it. But I think there's going to be a new third sleeve to this industry, which is a cislunar economy that's going to develop pretty aggressively over the next decade. And I think if I have the number right, there's like 90 missions going to the moon by the end of the decade. There's a Japanese commercial lunar lander right now on the way to the moon with paying commercial customer payloads on it. And there's 2 more that may launch on a direct route to the moon that may beat it there.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating and very futuristic, Chris. Thanks for that answer. Dave has a comment. He mentioned that you spoke about debris removal, and he does add his perspectives on that. That he thinks the big argument for debris removal is that it makes the space environment safer to operate in. Thus, it's more attractive to commercial companies to build the ecosystem. And then he continues to ask the question, do you have any thoughts on the recent statements from Russia that commercial satellites can be legitimate targets in wartime, and the impact that it will have on the space ecosystem?
Oh, yeah. So this is perhaps one of those black swan events that we don't like to talk about, but we're pushing the limits right now of finding out how this all plays out, which is, there are commercial companies. I'll name one, Maxar, and they operate imaging satellites, and they have a contract with the government, and they basically give the U.S. government about 80% control over the shutter of the camera. So the government gets to pick what's being imaged. Now, that satellite was built and funded by a private commercial company. But if you were sitting in Russia's shoes, would you look at that and say, oh, well, it's commercial, so we can't shoot it down? Now, the point being, it is definitively an act of war to actively destroy someone's satellites. And that's something that nobody says publicly, but Russia has made statements, various ministers, maybe even Putin himself, that commercial satellites serving military purposes are legitimate targets. There was some discussion, and here's the problem. If you're a commercial operator, what are those insurance clauses in there about acts of war, don't count? And this would be an act of war. So are you totally flying blind? Like if your satellite gets shot down while you're helping the government, you got no recourse, no insurance. I mean, it could theoretically, if people thought this was a real threat, they would stop providing those services to the government. So I've seen some articles or discussions around the fact that the government should make an explicit offer, to basically provide backstop insurance for commercial operators that might be impacted by hostile actions. Nothing's happened with that. But it doesn't even have to be as explicit as a ground ascent missile. We all saw at the very start of the war, the Russians hacked into Viasat's consumer broadband system and literally fried all the modems, right? That was a cost that Viasat just had to take. And there's obviously a lot of GPS jamming and other activities going on. So it's a pretty active and fluid situation here. It's like the space debris issue. It is a tragedy of the commons problem because nobody is responsible for enforcing or penalizing. We're all expected to act on our best behavior. And I do think, with the FCC having come out and imposed a time limit mandate for deorbiting satellites, the Europeans will follow pretty quickly. And then you beget what really is a de facto global law. Now, the Russians and Chinese may not choose to play along nicely. I suspect they won't. But at least for the Western world, you're not going to be able to sell your satellite communication service or your IoT service or your satellite imagery to US customers. You will not get license and approval and landing rights unless you choose to abide by their satellite disposal rules. So that Dave would know better. I think that proposal, which the FCC put out, literally within the last couple of months, is still out there for comment. But I haven't seen the type of pushback that we saw even 2 or 3 years ago. There was a much more mundane attempt by the FCC to basically say, if you're below 700 kilometers, you should really have propulsion on board so that you can deorbit it. And the industry went ape. And there was huge pushback and they shelved that rule. Now they come out with something much more comprehensive and restrictive. And I'd say there's been a bit of crickets in terms of response. So I think attitudes are changing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Chris, and while we are on the geopolitics topic, you did, or Quilty Analytics did publish, I saw on the LinkedIn feed that there were 186 launches in 2022, of which 87 were from the US, 64 from China, I think 22 from Russia. Can you talk, how does the technology and regulation and all the other geopolitical aspects with regard to what's going on in the US, in China, in Russia, and in other countries?
Yeah. So I'll start by saying I am not an expert in space law. It is obviously a very, very narrow area of practice. And quite honestly, I would argue it's not as well understood. In other words, both the FCC and the ITU and every other regulator in the world, including the Europeans, have the ability to regulate independently and in their own manner. They don't necessarily, coordinate. So I'll give you an example. SpaceX is launching 4,500 satellites. Both of those organizations agree there's a clock. Like, you can't squat on that license and not use it. And so there's sort of these mandatory dates by which you have to do certain things. Like 50% of your satellites have to be launched by X date. But the FCC and ITU have totally different rules around what you have to do by what date. So I'll start by saying it's complex, and it is also geopolitical. The Outer Space Treaty signed in the 60s and God, was it the Moon Treaty? A lot of these treaties that were passed were based on assumptions that are totally null and void today. Those treaties didn't really contemplate that commercial private companies would be doing this stuff. And so the rules are a little vague. It says, well, the government has to regulate what these people do, if commercial companies are going to do something, but there's no rules around what, the government may say or allow people to do. So, look, it's a challenging situation. And I did a short call out to the government, thanks for the money, man. But we don't have enough time in this podcast to go through all the crappy things that the government does to screw things up. That happens across the industry in every domain, from manufacturing to launching. Let's talk about launch, right? Because we talked, you started the discussion around, this was a record year. There have never been more launch events in history. And SpaceX, 61 launches this year, up from 31 the year before, and it was probably 20 something the year before that. And they say they're going to do 100 this year. Unprecedented. Most years in history, there were never 100 launches by any, by the world. So big changes afoot. But even in things like launch, there are bottlenecks, and the bottleneck is a spaceport. Right? You got to have a place to launch from. And as it turns out, because we all know the Earth spins in a certain direction, you basically want to launch on the East Coast, right? And the reason why is most every rocket, now the Starship will be different, right? The whole rocket is reusable, but most rockets, you're going to drop the first stage or the second stage or the third stage as you fly downrange. Now, the Chinese and Russians, when they built their spaceports, they built them inland to keep them away from the prying eyes of Western governments. And they really just didn't give a shit if they dropped the first stage on some village downrange. And you can go YouTube it and see these big toxic plume clouds and the kids running around and whatnot. But even they, the Chinese have moved to some, eastward facing launch ports, launch spaceports, whatever, I'm screwing it up. So the point is, where do we launch from the East Coast? The Cape. Where do we launch from the West Coast? Out of Annenberg. That's 98% of all launches that have ever gone out of the United States. That's kind of a choke point. And give the guys at Cape Canaveral credit. Years ago, they were saying we could theoretically do 50 launches a year. And now they're talking 300 launches a year. But there's a natural limit to how many times you can launch. So Elon Musk a decade ago, realized that there was going to be this choke point and started building his own spaceport down in Boca Chica, Texas, Brownsville. And it took him 2 years to get the environmental approval. And then it took him, 4 years to get the environmental sign off. And well, regardless, they've done some testing down there, but, it still hasn't really become an active port. And they're trying to launch Starship. They were supposed to launch it last year. The FAA delayed and delayed and delayed the approval. And then finally, they gave him a 95-point, you must do all these things before we'll let you launch, which is included. And I shit you not, I could not make this up. There was a requirement to write I'll call it a book report on the Civil War history of Brownsville, Texas. There's another requirement to hire a full-time marine biologist to, monitor the flora and fauna and whatnot. Like, the Chinese have a lander on the moon trying to turn it into the fucking Spratly Islands. And we're writing book reports about Brownsville, Texas. Give me a break. So, there's areas where the government's a helping hand, and my God, I wish they could just get out of their way a lot of times.
Yeah, that's an insightful comment. Thanks, Chris. One more question around the recent news and what you have spoken about, and Caleb from Quilty Analytics has spoken about, is SpaceX entering into the in-flight Wi-Fi market, and SpaceX signing this deal with T-Mobile for direct to device access. Can you talk a bit about those two deals and the opportunities which those will create for others?
Yeah, so maybe I'll roll back quickly. Why is SpaceX building Starlink, which is a 4,500 satellite LEO broadband constellation? And the answer is, despite what they may tell you now, that they have a bleeding heart for people wearing loincloths, living in mud huts that don't have internet connectivity, which they don't, and they never will. That was not the focus. That was not the reason why that they built Starlink. They built Starlink because SpaceX, although they're the most successful launch company out there, they're playing in a $5 billion a year market. And that is simply not a big enough market to fund the building of a colony on Mars, which is SpaceX's goal. So the idea for Starlink came out of like, hey, what is an adjacency that we could do that's a bigger TAM than the market we're in? And it's like, oh, well, we could build a constellation and provide services. And then you scratch your head and you say, well, wait a second. Aren't all your customers people who launch satellites to provide satellite communications? And yeah, they are, but SpaceX has the market power, right? With the lowest launch costs and the most efficient system, that it didn't matter. They're effectively competing with their customers and said, yeah, screw you, we're going to do it anyways. Now, what has Starlink become, or what can it become? Certainly it is it is transformative in ways that we've seen, for example, in Ukraine, where Starlink has been used, aggressively to fulfill things that would have cost 10, 100 times more if done with standard government communication systems, and proved incredibly resilient. Can Starlink bridge the gap and connect the unconnected? I think they can. I mean, this is not a cheap system, right? It was designed as a very high capacity, low latency. I think it's more likely that they capture chunks of the high frequency trading market, right, than they do remote villages, because the economics don't work for the latter. But I guess the point is, when this was announced in 2015, both SpaceX and OneWeb announced these constellations. A lot of smart people, including myself, wrote research pieces that said this is a dumb idea and it's never going to happen and the economics don't work. And lo and behold, through the force of personality and SpaceX's ability to raise capital, and for that matter, OneWeb, Amazon, and others, their I'd say there's going to be at least 2, probably 3, maybe 4 of these LEO broadband constellations 10 years out from now.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Chris. And, for the last quarter of the hour, we'll spend on career. So, what kind of career opportunities you see for the audience? And our audience here is, the students, I believe, from the college, of course, the alums, and also the students from the business school. Based on everything you have said until now, it looks like there are a lot of problems to be solved in the space industry, which means there are a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurship and also for jobs. So can you talk a bit about career opportunities and what are the things which you see in people when you hire them, and how would you design your career if you were to go back 20 years in time?
Maybe I'm the wrong guy for that, because I just told you the series of mistakes and misperceptions that led to my current illustrious career, which is to say, be willing to take risks along the way. Things that you thought were huge failures could turn out to be blessings in disguise. I think that the reality is, fundamentally, you spend most of your waking hours of your life at work. So God help you if you do something that you don't enjoy. I wouldn't recommend anybody follow my way of doing business. Like, I don't watch TV. I don't, do a huge amount of reading of books, but I read incessantly about the space industry because I find it fascinating. And, I'd be happy to jump on and watch some documentary or read a book on the subject. And so, you have to be aligned with what you're doing and find something that you love. Now, I didn't know that I loved the space industry. I kind of fell into it through a series of accidents. But, for me, it's important when we hire people, I want to find somebody that's really passionate about this. And you see that at SpaceX. I mean, SpaceX, people who join the company believe in the vision, and they work like dogs because they believe in the vision. Nobody would put themselves through that, just for money. But, when I think about hiring people, actually, this was the best piece of career advice that was given to me was by that director of research at Raymond James who hired me. So like 2 years after I was at Raymond James, and here I am an analyst, he says, "Hey, I want you to go back up to Chicago to do some recruiting." And I was like, yeah, sure, I can do that. But I've answered hundreds of recruiting questions, but what I don't know is what am I asking? Like, what do you want? What are you looking for? And I think I was standing in his office at the time, and he points over to his desk to a picture of his kids, and he says, "Hey, you see that? Those are my kids. I love my kids dearly. But you know what? I don't spend a huge amount of time with my kids because I spend most of my time here at work. So do me one favor. When you hire somebody, don't hire any assholes, because I don't want to work with a bunch of assholes." And again, I think that it stuck with me. You want to work in an environment where, people are like-minded, you enjoy working with them, and it's something you're passionate about. That's really oblique. That was not helpful at all. But that's kind of where I arrived at. And the other thing is, become an expert, right? So I got one kid who's got cyber operations and a PhD in nuclear physics, who's in the Navy. My youngest one is a boat captain and jet ski tour guide. But you know what? She's got her captain's license. She's getting her master's license. She's doing all of her certifications. She can get her nursing degree in EMT. And, she loves being on the water. And I was like, that's fine. If that's what makes you happy, you don't have to be your brother. But damn it, don't sit on your ass and just do the bare minimum. Become so good at what you do that everybody wants to hire you, and you will never lack for work.
Thanks, Chris. And any insights on which parts of the space industry you think will be having most of the opportunities for entrepreneurship or for for career?
Yeah, so it's funny. I was just having a discussion internally here today because we mostly focus on SATCOM and Earth observation, and then all the hardware companies, right? Because these are the real companies. But I literally had a discussion this morning about, the plans for when we roll out a whole new vertical on cislunar space. And we've already talked about it. Some of the things that you can do from there. There are now 8 funded companies that I know of that are building commercial space stations. The ISS is retiring in 2030, 2032. There will never be an ISS again. NASA is provisioning for the commercial industry to develop this capability, and the government will become a customer of these commercial entities. Just like SpaceX developed their crew and cargo capsules, and the government buys that as a service. So that area of cislunar, and again, years ago, I would not talk about this stuff in polite company because people would look at me strange, and my wife would say they're never going to invite us back. But I can feel safe in saying that, what, some of this stuff is going to happen. It is going to get funded. And the reason I can say that is because the business model's closed. There's a commercial activity behind it. And again, that's the reason I'm so excited. There are companies that have government models, and look, you can't exist in this industry without having a government, focused business unit, because the government is today the biggest customer. But the potential is, where, looking years out, the government for many of these companies will become a minority of the revenue.
Thanks, Chris. And one more question. You have such a great research being published, and you track so many companies. Of course, I'm following you and Quilty Analytics on LinkedIn. I think that is a great way to follow everything which you share. What are the other ways the audience on this on this space talk can continue learning from you in future?
Yeah, so I'm going to tell everybody a secret here, and don't let the word out. Like, I hate social media. I don't have a Facebook account. I don't do Instagram. I have never looked at a TikTok video. Yes, I am a Luddite, but I'm a Luddite for a cause. So I do some stuff on LinkedIn. I kind of think LinkedIn's a little bit different, and Kim helps me a lot with that. So that's a good way to follow us. I will mention that in a little bit later this year, we're going to be rolling out a whole new platform and branding and logo and stuff. And the website now is pathetic. I built it myself. Yeah, it's pathetic. But when we have that new capability, you'll have an ability to go on there and, not even as a paying subscriber, you can go up and set up a home page and create customized content, and be a good way to see the filter of all the stuff that we're publishing in the news that we think is important. So, stay tuned for that. Other than that, I make cameo appearances in podcasts and industry trade pubs all the time. And, next time I'm in Chicago, maybe I can stop by and do this again in person.
Perfect. And there is a question, how can I contact Chris?
Chris at quiltyanalytics.com. Pretty easy.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Chris, for your time. It was great chatting, and I think we will be happy to have you back again, because there is so much which we could have covered. There were a few questions which we didn't get to, like space tourism and all of that. But hopefully we can get some time from you again this year. And I'll pass on the mic to Dave to close.
Thank you, Gaurav. Gaurav, I know you have a real job, but I think a podcast host might be in your future as well. That's sort of aligned with what Chris was saying. Chris, I really resonated with your comments about career development. My own career has been a bit of a random walk as well. And as another older guy looking back on my path, I want to just agree with you and emphasize that one of the things I've always thought is very very difficult to do is to try to lay out early in your career what you want your career to look like, because I think Yogi Berra said, prediction is hard, especially when it's about the future. You don't know what environment you're going to be in. And space is really like that. The space industry today looks nothing like it did when I was an undergrad at Chicago. The ability to learn, the ability to be agile. And I think I really resonated more, Chris, with the one thing you said, which when it comes to hiring, is don't hire assholes. And the way I interpret that is know your values, know the values of the organizations and the people you're working with, and try to align those. And as I look back on my career, it may not have been as intentional as that at the time, but I think that's what I've been able to do. And Chris, I think you probably have a similar path there. I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. I want to thank Alex and Eric and the group at Booth. I apologize profusely for forgetting to mention you at the beginning of the introduction, but Gaurav, again, thank you for helping out and making sure we could do that. Thank you all. Please, if you are interested in enjoying more of this programming from the Space Network, reach out. I put our LinkedIn group address in the chat, as well as my personal email. It's an easy one for Maroon geeks to remember. It's maroon87@gmail.com, and I always write back to Maroons. So thank you all so much. Chris, it's always great to see you.
Dave, I was going to say, I got one final thing. It's like when you go to the movies and they start running the credits and you're like, should I get up and go? And the trick is actually, like, if the lights come on, then you can go. But if the lights stay dim, then they're like hiding, the outtake. So this is an outtake. And you asked me about career, and I just thought about it. And this is going to seem strange coming from the guy who said he has no social media. I would say the other most important thing you can do with your career is make connections. Right. And that was probably the most important thing. I forgot everything I learned at Chicago, and I had to relearn it again. But, the connections of people that you make will be your most important asset you will ever have in your business career. And again, I'm not great because I'm not using the social media to stay in touch with people, but I can't tell you how many times folks who I met with and maybe didn't spend as much time with as I should have circled back in my career and become people who have become advocates or helpers or links to opportunity. So, however you do it, it can be done without social media. You can't go without LinkedIn, but that's definitely, and it's good to stay in touch with people. So sorry, I ruined your perfect close, Dave.
Gosh, no, Chris, that was perfect. It's all about relationships. I think that's the perfect way to end it.
Great.
Thank you. Chris, it's always a pleasure to see you. Thank you.
Thanks. Enjoyed it.
And likewise, I just want to thank everyone again for tuning in. Chris, it was a pleasure to hear from you. Chris Quilty is really the leading Wall Street analyst in the space and satellite sector. It was such a pleasure to hear from you today. I want to give extra kudos to Dave Fisher and Gaurav Kumar, who have really built up the Space Network and brings such passion and insight to building the space community within the University of Chicago. So thank you so much. I want to encourage everyone to join us for a curated professional development series in sequences rather in leadership, social impact, technology, and creative careers during Career Month. Also subscribe to the UChicago Alumni Career Program's newsletter, dropping a link in the chat. That newsletter is twice a month, zero spam, to hear the latest on other UChicago development, career development opportunities and stories of alumni in various industries. And look forward to seeing you again. Coming up, we have, for example, a workshop on how to use experimentation to make data-informed decisions. So check out the full lineup and keep in touch. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thanks.